Hello my dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 25th of December. Today we have some interesting updates to discuss, so let's start. And first I would like to discuss with you some conclusions that the Institute of Study of War made during the previous days, and they think that the Russians decided to make some kind of operational pause in the vicinity of Bakhmut. They think, the Institute of Study of War, that the Russians decided to stop, to slow down, and to think what are they going or planning to do next. It's some kind of their conclusion according to the open source information they have, and to tell the truth, I must say that I completely agree with them. Not because of the fact that the Russians stopped or they decided to slow down, because to tell the truth, it's very difficult to understand, because I don't have anybody from Wagner's who are able to tell me this information that they decided to stop or something like this. But I believe that it's a very if the Russians decided to stop or to slow down near Bakhmut, it is a very smart decision. And first of all is because of the number of forces that Ukrainians managed to deploy around Bakhmut. If we take a look at deployment map, we see that Bakhmut is the most concentrated, it's over-concentrated area with Ukrainian forces. And I believe that any type of offensive operation from the Russian side in any direction, no matter if we're talking about Solidar or Yakovlevka or Bakhmut or Chasov Yar or Klishchevka or Toretsk-New-York agglomeration, these operations are suicide operations. First of all, and the Russians will burn, not just reduce their own reserves, they will burn them very fast. And this is exactly what the Ukrainians needs. They need to reduce the Russians as much as possible. The same thing the Russians need. So I believe that if it's true, I believe it's a very smart decision from the Russian side to stop, to slow down. We know that the Russians achieved significant success on the Bakhmut front line. They got very close to Klishchevka, they got control over Kudryumovka, Zaryanovka, and now the only thing they need to do is to destroy or reduce the Ukrainians in this area. They don't need to attack. Of course, from media perspective, from perspective of the timings of this war and so on, the Russians, we will see the Russians from the weak side, of course, that they can't do anything, they can't develop, but it's about us, about our understanding of this special operation. We are not on the front line, we are not fighting against Ukrainians, we are not fighting against the Russians, our friends are not dying or not killed by the enemy in the trenches. So from this perspective, we want to see the progress. But from the military perspective, sometimes it is important and necessary to make a pause, because just take a look one more time at the deployment map, and I believe that it's very difficult to penetrate these defense orders. The thing that the Russians are able to do to to reduce and to wait some time. Maybe this operation will take months or two, or maybe more, before the Russians will be able to continue. But anyway, if it's necessary to do this, then it should be done. If we are talking about Donetsk front line itself, the Russians reported that during the previous 24 hours they made few attempts of offensive operation near Bakhmut, and as a result of those attacks, the Ukrainian lost around 80 soldiers and something around 11 armored vehicles. By the way, the Institute of Study of War have updated their map. As you can see, this is Bakhmut on the north, this is Kurdyumovka, and this is Makeivka. If you remember, yesterday we discussed that the Russians made two offensive operations, one of them in direction of Delivka and another one in direction of Druzhba. The Institute of Study of War has updated their map, showing like it's not a progress, it's these yellow clouds shows that it's like what the Russians says in official media sphere, that let's say that Russian forces on the ground, on Telegram channels, public information that the Russians achieved success in direction of Delivka. Instead of Study of War show this information with a yellow cloud on the map, shows that what the Russians says on the ground, so what kind of success they have. Maybe this is a fake, maybe this is a speculation, maybe the Ukrainians by this time managed to push the Russians back, nobody knows, but at least they are saying that we completed this goal and we developed this bridgehead in this direction. So this is the situation that we discussed yesterday. Some interesting. This is the first update about Bakhmut. So we discussed that the Ukrainians managed to deploy a lot of forces, that the Russians decided to slow down and stop in this area, and this is very smart because of very big number of forces. But today we got another very interesting update, and this update comes from Zaporizhzhia area. And the Russians mark this area with some certain icon. This icon has the title of like defense line, as you can see, and there are some pictures and so on. If you have access to this map, you're able to open these pictures and you will be able to see. And the thing is that this icon says that the Russians, by let's say by these days, by today, maybe yesterday, the day before yesterday, so let's say by the second half of December, they completed the mission, or they completed the process of preparation of defense line in the Zaporizhzhia area. And a lot of military experts from the Russian sources, a lot of officers on the ground are saying that now it's impossible from the Ukrainian side to cross these defense orders. So that means that during these months, as soon as the Ukrainians completed offensive, or not completed, as soon as the Russians completed the mission of retreating from Kherson and so on, from that moment, for more than 2 months, the Russians were completely focused on preparing defense orders, defense lines between Orekhov, Gulay Polye front lines and, let's say, Tokmak, Melitopol, Berdyansk area. So if we update Western sources map, I understand that according to the Russian sources, they prepared this defense line. And furthermore, they're saying that they prepared 3, 4, 5, and maybe 6 lines of defense orders in front of Melitopol. So, and they're saying that there are no such armies in the world, there is no such an army in the world, and they're not talking about the Ukrainians, who are able to cross these defense orders and who are able these days to attack Melitopol or to return control over this town. So as you can see, I believe that these two updates about the completion of preparing defense orders in Zaporizhzhia area and decision that the Russians took to slow down their offensive operation in Bakhmut are completely connected between each other, and it's two situations of the same pictures. I believe that the Russians started offensive operation in direction of Bakhmut with very heavy losses. Believe me, they had a lot of losses, but mainly they used prisoners or ex-prisoners as the main forces to storm Bakhmut. So that's why we don't see any media effect, any media voice or noise from this event, because I'm not saying that this is a very bad guys, but I believe that nobody counts ex-prisoners in Russian Federation whose terms in prison was up from 10 or even more years or something like this. So nobody counted them. So that's why we haven't seen a lot of media effect of their losses, but I believe that there were a lot of losses from the Russian side. But anyway, I believe that there was some kind of false flag. The Russians were, I'm not saying that the progress that they achieved Kurdyumovka, Zaryanovka was like under fake operation. No, if we are talking about Klishchevka, Andreevka, Kurdyumovka, Zaryanovka, this is the real operation that the Russians needed to complete it. I'm talking about Bakhmut. It was I was very surprised, and we discussed Bakhmut for many times about difficultness of taking this town, because if we were talking about Mariupol was completely encircled. If we are talking about any single town in Ukraine that the Russians managed to take, there were some problems from the Ukrainian side to support. If we are talking about Severodonetsk, there is a Seversky Donetsk river that is very difficult to cross and supply forces to Severodonetsk. If we are talking about Lysychansk, the Russians managed to penetrate defense orders in Toshkovka, Gorska, Zolotoye, and they have almost completed this town, so that's why the Ukraine decided to retreat. And if we are talking about Bakhmut, there is an area, I'm talking about the northwest area, that is completely protected by the Ukrainians, and they do have possibilities to supply and support this town, and they do have like endless sources to do this, and it will take a lot of time from the Russian side before they are able to get this area and to cut this supplies route. So that's why operation of taking Bakhmut was very surprise to me, and was, I believe that it was a very difficult operation. I'm not saying that I don't believe that the Russians are able to do this. They are able to do this. The only question is about the price that the Russians can pay for this. And because of these two updates about slowing down in Bakhmut and completion of preparation of defense lines in Zaporizhzhia area, I believe that all these attacks in direction of Bakhmut was some kind of fake attacks that forced the Ukrainians to deploy as much as possible of their reserves in this area just with one purpose: to stop down the Russians. Meanwhile, with this situation, with this tactic, with this strategic situation, the Russians achieved one important goal. They freeze the Ukrainian forces and did not allow them to start that possible offensive operation in Zaporizhzhia area. If you remember, starting from August of this year, we discussed many times, and many Western military experts and the Russian military experts were talking just about one thing: the upcoming offensive operation in Zaporizhzhia. But this offensive operation didn't take place. And mainly, I believe, is that because the Russians attacked Bakhmut, the Ukrainians were forced to deploy a lot of forces there. So by this situation, the Russians broke the Ukrainian plans. And meanwhile, the Russians prepared a lot of lines of fortifications and trenches and everything it possible to prepare in front of Ukrainian army in Zaporizhzhia area. And now the Russians have completed this situation, this preparation, and exactly at this moment, the Russians took decision to slow down in Bakhmut. So I believe that these two situations is completely connected between each other, and I think that maybe during the winter period of time, we won't see any offensive operation from the Russian side. Furthermore, I believe, and something tells me, that maybe the Russians will stop development in Bakhmut. We will see the local fights, we will see artillery duels, and we know that the ratio between the Russians and Ukrainian artillery attacks is 6-1. So the Russians are able to attack, to send 6 shells, and the Ukrainians are able to answer just with 1. So that means that we are going to see some local fights, and I believe that Ukrainians are going to have more losses than the Russians, and the Russians will have some progress, but just according on basis on this simple mathematics. So the Russians attack more, they have more possibilities, the Ukrainians have more losses, the Ukrainians are forced to step back under heavy Russian fire, and the Russian takes the Ukrainian positions. So this is what we're going to see on Bakhmut frontline during the next 1 or 2 months. So I believe so. I believe so that maybe we're going to see something like this. The same situation on Kupiansk-Limon front line. The Russians have, significant superiority in artillery systems, and the Ukrainians has less artillery systems, less ammo and shells, so that's why they are forced to defend, they are forced to step back, and they are forced to have more losses than the Russians. If we're talking about Kupiansk-Liman front line, the Ukrainians during the previous 24 hours lost around 90 soldiers and something around 13 armored vehicles. But if we're talking about the ground, the situation hasn't been changed since yesterday. So that's why I believe that this front line is stabilized as well. The Russians don't take, they're not making any attempts of counteroffensive operation. And I believe that maybe they're not planning to do any for some period of time, at least maybe by the end of this year. If we are talking about South Donetsk and Donetsk area as well, Marinka has been stabilized as well. Pavlovka, Ugledar front line has been stabilized as well. There are clashes. Maybe the only the possible area where the Russians might achieve some success is Marinka, and let's say the northwest part of western northwest part of Donetsk, where the Russians will be forced to attack, because as you can see according to this map, Donetsk is under very heavy fire. The Ukrainians attack without aiming, without calculating, without thinking, and there are a lot of casualties among civilians. And if we are talking about the entire front line, according to my understanding of the situation, Donetsk is the only problem that the Russians have these days. So as soon as the Russians are able to reduce shelling and reducing Donetsk, at this very moment they are able to freeze this conflict completely. for many years, for 5, for 10, for 20 years. Anyway, the Russians sooner or later will return back to Ukraine, and in 20, in 30, in 50 years, they will. I believe that there are going to be more conflict between Russia and Ukraine, and sooner or later, if nothing changes, if the Ukrainians are not able to turn the situation, the Russians will be able to achieve their success. But for now, they need to freeze, at least for a few months before their, I don't know how to say, they're remaking their military industrial sphere. They need to completely turn everything in their military sphere. They need to build their own drones. They need to increase the creation of more shells. Starting the military operation, they have completed just one mobilization process, and by today they haven't completed the trainings of entire mobilized army. So they mobilized 300,000 soldiers, and there are still forces who is in the training centers. The Russians announced about mobilization in October. Today the new year has we like in 25th of December, and by today the Russians haven't completed the training procedures with these forces. So there are a lot of things to do. There are going to be more mobilizations in the Russian Federation, and they need to complete the trainings with these forces as well. They need to complete the reestablishing process with their economy, with oil, with gas, with everything. So it's obviously the Russians need a pause, a small pause. They don't need to freeze to end this conflict. They need to end and to freeze this conflict just on the ground, without signing any papers. And somewhere in August, they need to start everything from the beginning with completely new army, with completely, modernized army, with a new weapon, and to get more objectives on the territory of Ukraine. And from the Ukrainian side, we understand that they need completely different situation. They need to start counteroffensive operation to achieve as much as possible and to sign some papers. And the most important, they need to have some guarantees from the United States of America. And they need the United States of America to sign to give their signature on the documents between the Russians and the Ukrainians. So a lot of things, but I believe that there is going to be something on the north. We discussed about this front line. I believe that during the winter period we are not going to see any active movements, just with one exception. And the exception is if the Ukrainians are going to collapse there. It is possible, of course. The Ukrainians might be collapsed by the Russians. They might lost patience. I don't know. They might lost any will to fight, and their army drop their weapon and stop back, run away across the fields. Of course, in this case, the Russians will activate their offensive operation. They will take as much as possible. But if the Ukrainians won't be collapsed by the Russians, I believe that there is something that is going to take place on the north of Ukraine, in Chernihiv and Kharkiv area. At least if you ask me, I would start something on the north of Ukraine, in this area. For many reasons. Of course, the most important one is media reason to open another front line, to take more territories, just to finish this active period with some achievements, with some development, and then to freeze everything for maybe for a year, or for 7 months, or 8 months, or 6 months, no matter, just to freeze, while the Russians are doing all these changes in their economy, in their military sphere of life, and so on. And if you ask me, what would I do on the Russian side if I wanted to achieve some success? Of course, the most obvious and the most easiest situation that the Russians are able to achieve is to take control over this part of Ukraine. And this is a very important area because from one side, there are not much forces. This area is not so important for the Ukrainians. There are no industrial zones. There are no plants. There are no, energy facilities, power plants. There are nothing there. Just the people who they need to pay salaries to feed them and so on. So from this perspective, this area is not so important. The most important thing that this area has is the railroad. This railroad. If you take a look at this map, you see that this railroad connects two important towns from the Russians. it's Gomel, it's the territory of Republic of Belarus, and on the west, on the east, it's Belgorod, like the most important base of the Russians in this special operation. So if the Russians are able to establish control over this railroad, of course, from this perspective, they will be able to reduce their logistic losses. Anyway, they will be able to do this because I tried to calculate. There is a strict railroad. You don't need to get on the station. Then you don't need to, to change the lines, to waste your time. You can start at Gomel, and after that, you need to pass around 425 kilometers, and you will be in Belgorod on the strict railroad direction. And if we're talking about the situation that we have right now, the Russians need to spend around 700 kilometers around this territory. They need first to go from Gomel to Bryansk, then to Oryol, maybe to Kursk, from Kursk to Gomel. So the distance is bigger, and maybe it's not very flexible, not very comfortable, not very quite good for the Russians. So I'm not saying that this railroad are able to give the Russians significant success and that this situation are able to break this situation. But anyway, this offensive operation will increase and will make the Russian position much better. Because from this situation, the Russians are able to take Sumy, and maybe they will be able to take Chernigov. At least they will be able to encircle. And during the next months, let's say they do this winter, they take these territories, and they will be forced to spend some time on Sumy and Chernigov. And to tell the truth, it will be the best situation for the Russian forces as a training centers on the real situation on the war. They will have losses, of course, but they are able to do this slowly, step by step, to take these two towns, then to make some referendums there in these areas, to join these territories and make them a part of Russian Federation. From the other side, if the Russians attack in this area, they will be able to do this from their own territory, but not from the territory of Republic of Belarus. So that means that they don't need to involve a third party in this conflict, and nobody from the Western countries will be able to make another sanctions on restriction of the territory of Belarus. And the most important thing, they will be able to open another front line, and the Ukrainians will be forced to move some reserves from the hottest point of Ukraine in the eastern part to the north part. And this is one of the most important things that the Russians are able to achieve. And somewhere in August, by the time the Russians establish complete control over the north, by the time the Russians make referendums of this territory, by the time the Russians make some changes in their constitution, after that, somewhere in September, August or October, the Russian can start another step of offensive operation and to complete the special military operation at all. Don't forget that in 2024, there are going to be elections on the territory of Russian Federation, and the citizens of Russian Federation are going to elect the president of Russian Federation. This situation is going to happen in 2024. So obviously the Russians need a solution by this time. They can't be in active phase of war during the election process. They need to complete this war before elections. So, and it's just like a matter of tactic, how are they going to complete. But I believe that by the end of the next December, the Russians will try to complete the mission by more developments, by more achievements on the ground, and so on. But on the 2024, according to the Russians' needs, they will try to stop the conflict and to sign some papers and to give their civilians, population, Russian Federation, that there are no war, everything is fine, and let's complete with the elections. Maybe after elections they will start everything from the beginning, who knows? But at least for half a year before elections, I believe at least they need to stop everything. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds you to condemn any violence in Ukraine. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon. Have a good day. Bye bye.